Oh Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a newcomer into the temple, coming to us from his particular humble abode of Mythforged Games, creator of the in development DragonRune, the one and only Jason Murray. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on and braving time zone hell. Nobody called him Dell. We've heard that joke too many times. But it's a bit of a tradition around here to open with the humble beginnings. So, with that in mind, walk me through your first introduction to role-playing games and what made it stick.
So I have a weird relationship with role-playing games, and I don't mean that in like that they are weird, but like, well, let me just tell you the story. So I grew up in a tiny little town where like there was 250 people in my high school. Like that's like how small, and it went from 6th to 12th grade. So we had like 30 people in a class. Anyway, nobody there played video games or especially not TTRPGs. They weren't really into like fantasy and stuff. Like I was the weird kid. So but a friend of mine from another school knew that I liked Dragon Ball. This is back in the 90s when all this stuff was like first happening. And he asked me if I'd ever played Chrono Trigger, and I hadn't. And so he hooked me up with Chrono Trigger. I loved it. And I started digging around for other stuff. Got into Final Fantasy through the powers of emulation, as they were back in the day. I played through some of the early Final Fantasies and fell in love with this idea of like turn-based stuff and whatever. And I read somewhere that they were based loosely on D&D, which I kind of heard about, but like knew nothing about. And a cousin of mine was dating this lady who found out I was interested in D&D, and she was telling me all these stories about her D&D escapades. And I thought it sounded like the coolest thing ever. But nobody around me played, and so got online and was looking for D&D online. Found a message board dedicated to Sailor Moon role playing, and I was into Sailor Moon. It was cool. So check this out, and they didn't use rules or anything. It was all more like story game stuff. Like we had characters and we talked. Yep. And one of the folks there, that's where I met my wife, actually, funnily enough. But the guy who actually kind of got us talking originally, his dad played D&D way back. Like he actually apparently played D&D with Gygax, like in the like mid to late 70s. Kind of thing, like way back. And he's like, oh yeah, man, like the third edition's coming out, like get the books or whatever. And you're about to, like, I was about to go off to college. He's like get the books, you'll find somebody at college, and you need to play, because of course this is way back before BTTs or anything like that too. Like so I was like, okay, cool. Like I went ahead and bit the bullet. I got the third edition books, and college I started asking around, and I found a group and played, and it was cool. It was really cool, and it was every bit as interesting and cool as it seemed like it was going to be. But I literally wanted to play a TTRPG for 6 or 7 years before I actually got a chance to. Mm-hmm. So I was addicted before I ever even touched dice. Yeah. So like I said, it's a weird story. Like most people it finds them. I was literally like digging around on the internet trying to find more information about it back in those early days. So,
and if it's any consolation, there is no story that anyone can tell me that is too weird for the introduction. Because, well, for one, I've always made clear I'm more concerned about the fact that someone's at the dance rather than how they got there. Because regardless of how you got here, or how you're playing, the fact that you're playing is enough. But I know that a lot of folk have said the whole Final Fantasy was inspired by D&D. If you mind a bit of a history lesson, I've learned over the years that's not entirely the truth. At least not directly in the way people think. Because here's a bit of a hard truth. D&D has not had a major foothold in Japan since the early 80s.
Yeah, actually, the Lodos War, that's actually another like part of my path towards Sci-Fi Channel here in the US. That very early on they played anime, and they played the first episode of the OVA of Lodos War. And I thought that was cool, and I found out on the internet that was based on D&D, and I ended up going and buying the entire VHS set of the OVA. It's still one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
So yeah, 100%.
There's still a lot of Lodos that never got animated.
Oh yeah, no. There are people who are translating those books. I vaguely participated in that at one point.
Yeah, and those folks are doing God's work, but
I agree.
It's more like the big elements when it came to Final Fantasy were things like Wizardry, Ultima, and Dragon Quest. And I've told a bit of the story when I did my whole video a while back about why I don't care for the term JRPG. But any game, any property, whether it be an anime, whether it be a video game that came out of Japan that people say was D&D inspired, was more likely Wizardry inspired.
Yeah,
Wizardry.
That's true.
Was huge in Japan, and it's to the one of the conceits around Dragon Quest creation was to try and make a version of Wizardry that was simplified for the Famicom.
Because that's another one of my favorites. Dragon Quest is so good. That's such a good series.
And there was also the fact that that Katakawa, who also had Shueisha under their banner, had a computer gaming magazine, and they wanted their own game to promote in it. But the other thing is that sort of wargame like setup that never really caught on in Japan. A lot of people who got into tabletop in Japan came in from computer gaming. And with AD&D, by the time that finally reached Japanese store shelves, games like Tunnels and Trolls had come along and beat it to the punch. And Tunnels and Trolls wasn't so intensive when it came to minis. It was a smaller book, and it only used D6s.
I think RuneQuest was also apparently pretty big at the time over there.
RuneQuest, and by extension, the whole basic role-playing family has a very, very, very dedicated following.
Call of Cthulhu was like their... Yeah, I think Call of Cthulhu, isn't that like the highest rated in Japan these days?
As far as
like
foreign games, yeah.
Foreign, just specifically for foreign games,
the biggest homegrown is still Sword World. And
yes.
Sword World came about because TSR didn't want to play ball.
Yep.
Because what happened was, and you're probably familiar with some bits.
Again, mostly through the Lodos fandom that I'm kind of loosely part of. I've heard some of this before, Ryo Mizuno
was the only one in the group SNE crowd who knew how to run AD&D, because at the time it wasn't translated. Only like the basic red box got translated. And it's when Lodos started to hit big, starting with the replays that were originally in Dragon Magazine, not the Dragon Magazine we're familiar with, a completely different one.
Yep.
There was the idea of, hey, maybe we can make this an official D&D setting. And they reached out to TSR to try and do that, but either TSR wasn't answering their calls, or they just weren't willing to play ball with Group SNE, so nothing came of it. So they ended up using a modified version of a rule set that they had put for a PC game based on the Grey Witch novel, the first Lodos novel. And that's how we get Sword World. So when people say certain anime or the like are inspired by D&D, it's a much larger degree of separation. I would even go so far as to say that the original Sword World replays barely resemble D&D in the way we know it.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
And trying to apply D&D to Sword World, whether it be 1.0, 2.0, or 2.5, just falls flat on its face.
Yeah.
Even Goblin Slayer, which I think the creator of the light novel said the stories in that were based on his D&D adventures in college, but given some of the characterizations in there, I have to wonder if he was actually playing Sword World instead.
Well, I mean, I imagine even in Japan, certain thing. I'm not an expert on Japanese culture, obviously, but I would imagine they have a similar tendency that we do, of like, Kleenex as a instead of tissue. You know what I'm saying? Like using a brand name that's like the most common. So it's probably kind of like a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm playing D&D," and they mean they're actually playing Traveler or whatever.
Not from what I've seen.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well.
So,
like I said, I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't pretend to be.
I'm not saying that he was. I'm not saying he was lying about it. It could have been the translator interpreting that as D&D.
That makes sense too. Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, it's not like, say, Nasu, who admitted that D&D played a factor in some of his early stories, and I can definitely see the DNA of both that and Call of Cthulhu. Especially like the whole thing of, like in the Fate series, how people can be summoned, how heroic spirits can be summoned as different classes. That's not far removed from the class qualifications thing in early D&D. Where you had
that's a good point. Never thought about that. Yeah.
You had to meet certain ability score. You had to make your ability scores and then pick a class based on the scores set up. Now that
and Paladin was hard.
Yeah, and obviously that's fallen by the wayside most, and it's. I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing that you don't see that as much, because it's a different kind of setup. It's a lot. For the longest amount of time, the idea was you build your stats and then you build your character off of those stats, and as time has gone on and the war game influence has kind of drifted apart, it's become the opposite. You build your character concept and then you build your stats around that. Neither one is better or worse. They're just different. And
I've had fun both ways. But I prefer the more modern character concept to stats. But I've had fun with a randomly generated character that was just, I had to figure out what in the world to do with this guy that had a 6 strength or whatever.
And it is fun. It is, when I looked at Dragonbane and I looked at the inspirations you had mentioned. First off, what I find is funny is that the 3 BRP games you've mentioned, I've covered all of them on this channel in one form or another. And of course, like, I covered the One Ring, though I covered the first edition during a month where I was just talking about Lord of the Rings RPGs. But what's funny about bringing up Dragonbane, although you put an S in there, is...
Did I?
Yeah.
I'll have to fix that.
is I honestly think that Dragonbane is one of the better introductory kind of affairs, especially
Mm-hmm.
given the stuff that you get out of the core set. Because
Mm-hmm.
the core set has a full 11 adventure 11 module adventure path right
Mm-hmm.
in the box.
Yep.
Whereas-
And it's actually really fun, but it's not overwhelming, which is delightful.
Yeah, and with that in mind, one of obviously with a name like DragonRune, people are going to be bringing up RuneQuest. I'm pretty sure I'm not the first to do that. Was that ever an influence into certain directions, or was that?
Most definitely, most definitely. So, um, basically, the whole so I started playing around with game design back in 2008. When I first started drifting away from D&D and then into Shadowrun and World of Darkness and all these other games, and I started making this system that was just a unholy mess of conflicting themes and whatever. And I messed with that for years, like literally 10 or 15 years, 10 years at least. And I eventually ended up just scrapping it because I never could make it work because it started off without any focus. Mm-hmm. So DragonRune is essentially the inheritor of the crunchier aspects of that game. It's not really, it's a spiritual successor, I guess you could say. A lot of the ideas that I learned from doing those years and years of playtesting and creating made me a better writer and a better understanding how games work and stuff. So when I finally decided it was time to pull the plug on the old game, I was like, okay, well, this is what I wanted to do with this part of it, and I think I can make something cool with just taking these ideas. So I was like, okay, so what games do I like? And that was right around the time that Dragonbane had just came out, and I was looking at doing a RuneQuest campaign using the Dragonbane rules. Mm-hmm. Because Glorantha is one of my favorite settings. Glorantha and Eberron and Shadowrun are three of the great settings as far as I'm concerned.
All right, I gotta ask one question then. How many pounds of D6s do you have at your Shadowrun campaigns?
yeah. We actually, my wife worked at a game store at one point, and we bought, and this was right around the time that we had just gotten into Shadowrun. It was 4th edition when 4th edition had just dropped, and we ended up buying I think it might have been all of the D6 sets they had at that time. I can't quite remember, but it was a significant. It was we had a whole bag of just D6s.
It could be worse. You could have had those D10s that were in the Exalted board game, which still are the ugliest dice I've ever seen. Have you ever seen?
We also, yeah, we don't have those, but we do have a whole bunch of D10s as well. My wife's favorite system is the new World of Darkness stuff, like the 2004 version, like Werewolf the Forsaken. It's now called Chronicles of Darkness, and I usually say New World of Darkness just to differentiate because we kind of prefer the first edition.
Yeah.
So, or I'll throw out the 2004 just to kind of emphasize which one I'm talking about because they are considerably different.
But I've been mixed on. I'm mixed when it comes to it. There's some stuff from old that I like. There's some stuff from new that I like. I will admit when it comes to Werewolf, I actually prefer Chronicles over or Old World, because the problem I had with Werewolf is that it kind of suffered from the Moriarty issue, since somehow every bad thing that's going on is somehow tied to the worm directly or indirectly. That's kind of like how somehow every crime that Sherlock Holmes was dealing with was somehow tied to Moriarty. That actually creates more problems than it solves.
Yeah, Yeah, I agree. We're Forsaken, Werewolf of the Forsaken, Changeling the Lost, are fantastic.
And then there's
Changeling the
Mage.
Dreaming.
Mhm.
Changeling the Dreaming is probably the only that and Mage the Ascension are probably the only two of the classic lines that I like. But I also like, obviously, Changing the Lost I think is actually better because I like the horror aspect of Changing the Lost, whereas Dreaming is it's a lot less horror related. But Vampire hands down is Requiem. I know that's a blasphemous, heretical thing to say.
We do not have blasphemy rules or that kind of thing in my monastery.
No, I like the more sandbox setup of the New World of Darkness stuff in general. Where there's less meta plot. There's almost no meta plot, and there's less background information in general, and it's much more flexible. So, like, if you don't like this thing or that thing, it's easy to just drop it, and things being more localized, like just all of them in general.
Did you ever play Scion?
Yes. We did, in fact, and I have so many weird stories from our one attempt at playing Scion. My wife and I are huge mythology nerds, which is one of the reasons why Glorantha works for us. We're both huge mythology nerds, and when Scion came out, we both were just like, "This looks awesome. We got to pick that up." And it was fun, but I feel like it wasn't the best marriage of system and concept.
I think a lot of people jumped on it thinking it was Exalted Modern, which on the barest surface level of paper it kind of is, but not necessarily. And I think instead of trying to be Exalted Modern, it should have taken the modern mythos approach instead, which it kind of did. But the way powers worked, I don't think it went far enough for the particular fantasy. What it really, really needed, in my opinion, was a way to create custom gifts. Because early on, there's the idea. It styles itself on 3 tiers: hero, demigod, god. Kind of matching the classical mythos. Early on, there's that motif of you are being given gifts from your divine patron, whether or not that patron is your parent, or you're just adopted from a different divine parent. Things like, say, the giant vein gun that one of the characters in the fiction has. And that being the main reason to have that is a way to channel the godly abilities. But there's not really a way to make custom ones, so a lot of people are just going to use the stock ones. And I think this, if your divine parent is say Twir, the bloody handed, the man who gave up his hand so that Fenris could be bound. I think that there should be some sort of rule set where the GM can create a custom gift built around the themes that you've set up, and there kind of isn't. And I think that was one of the stumbling points. The other one being the trying to force over a power system when this may be my own blasphemy, but I really think Scion should have just used a simplified version of a charm system.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I can see that.
Instead of, because the powers as dots thing, it was a little bit too restrictive for the concept, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think I agree with you.
That's something. It's very much something that is in the tradition of the World of Darkness stuff, but it doesn't fit there, and that's a big thing. You can't have a one size fits all when it comes to mechanics and concept and marrying that.
Yeah, that's a particular like house systems, whether like the Storyteller system or D20 or the Year Zero engine for Free League or BRP for Chaosium. Like, they're great if you make a lot of games that are roughly similar in style or tone or whatever. But you start looking at those like Dark Sun and Eberron for D&D, right? Dark Sun and Eberron, I don't think either one of those really fit the D20 system. And in fact, I've played a lot of Eberron in systems that were not D&D. Like, in fact, I played way more not D&D Eberron than I ever did actual D&D Eberron. And I think it works. I feel like it's the way everything's set up is too restrictive for the open high magic zaniness that Eberron really
that touches upon something when it comes to how people view fantasy, and that's been a pet peeve of mine for years. There's this idea that fantasy automatically necessitates the medieval pastiche of Western Europe. The Tolkien melting pot, as I often call it. And the fact of the matter is, that's just one avenue of fantasy, not the avenue. Yeah. And if you're doing fantasy, you shouldn't have to restrict yourself to that.
100%.
I brought up Dark Sun and Spelljammer. There's a case of two settings that have nothing in common. Dark Sun is a very sword and sorcery, almost sword and sandal kind of affair.
It has a very Bronze Age feel to it, and I only discovered Dark Sun in the last 3 or 4 years. So I'm very I don't have a whole lot of a grasp on the setting or whatever, but what little I've seen and read about, it feels almost like a Bronze Age kind of thing in a weird way with all the city states and stuff. Yeah, it
is very much something that I would expect Howard to write. Regarding how Howard views magic in his settings. And for that matter, how Howard views civilization in his settings, but that's another story.
Yes.
But on the other hand, you got Spelljammer, which feels like a pulp sci-fi story out of the 40s, maybe the 50s.
Yep.
With flying ships in space and all the weird species involved. That's not only that, but the kind of thing you would see on a power metal album cover any time in the last 50 years.
Yes.
Nothing wrong with that. I love power metal.
No,
don't get me wrong, and I love the evocative album covers you see in power metal. But the fact it still remains, and trying to do both of them are better served. And you brought up Eberron. The big thing one of the big things with Eberron is the magitech that it uses, as well as the dragon marks, which are a big part of the setting. And because of those, Eberron is something that better fits a system that's designed around epic power fantasies.
Especially because in 3rd edition they had the hero points to help kind of push that along a little bit, because I feel like even Keith Baker at the time, I can't swear, I'm not gonna speak for Keith Baker, but it feels to me when I read it that he's like, this isn't pulpy and heroic enough for what he wanted, so he's like, hero points is what we're gonna do. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but you basically, when you spend a hero point, you got to roll a D6 and add it to your D20. For anybody who's listening who may not be familiar with the old stuff, because I don't know if I doubt 5th edition has them.
No, but there is one 5e variant that has something close, and actually did so in an interesting way, and that is Tales of the Valiant, which was the Black Flag project that Cobalt did.
yes.
I did a deep dive on that a while back, and they repurposed luck instead of being a feat where you can get extra d20s in a limited way, as a pool that you generate every time you fail a roll. But But here's the thing: you can spend it to do a 1-to-1 modifier to your roll. You can spend 2 points to do a reroll, but it caps at 5 points. If you get an additional one, you have to roll a d4, and that becomes your point total.
Oh wow!
In other words, you're getting the points, but you cannot turtle with it.
Yeah. You know, if you got them, use them. Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Tales of the Valiant is interesting to me. Like, you know, it's giving me flashbacks to Pathfinder First Edition a little bit. And again, I'm not familiar with Tales of the Valiant. I haven't read it. Like, I have only the barest brush up against Fifth Edition. Like, Watsy and I kind of parted ways back in the late 2000s, and you know, I do not begrudge anyone playing 5e. I found that it wasn't my thing, and so kind of looked elsewhere. But you know, I've heard of some people dismiss Tales of the Valiant as just being, you know, oh, it's just 5th edition by someone else, and I've heard other people say, oh, it does different interesting things. And that's kind of the way Pathfinder was. First edition Pathfinder was kind of like 30.5, but it did something like the grappling rules were way better. For instance, I remember that specifically. So that's cool. I have a close friend who's actually still really into D&D, and I don't know that Dragonbane's ever going to really click for them. So I may point them towards Tales of the Valiant.
I did a video breaking down the difference between the 5e classes and the Tales of the Valiant classes. And the summation that I had is that for people who want something D&D like but didn't care for the direction of the 2024 project, Valiant is certainly going to fit, because there were a few major changes that were worth noting. Because almost every class got an overhaul, some a little bit less so because they didn't really need too much change. But every class gets their subclass at 3rd level, for one. No class has any dead levels. So you're always getting something. Feats are categorized, and depending on what class you pick, you are going to get you're going to get access to certain types of feats. Your ASI is usually +1 in one ability, and then a feat instead of having feats be an ASI alternative. ASI, of course, being ability score improvement.
Okay. I was like, what's an ASI? I'm with you.
Instead of each individual class having their own exclusive spell list, there are 4 spell lists that are assigned to different classes and subclasses. You know, Arcane, Divine, Primal, which is mostly for druids, and Weird, which is mainly used by warlocks.
That sounds a little bit like, didn't 4th edition do something kind of like that?
It had the power source thing, but each class had their own list of powers under the AEDU format.
Oh, okay. Again, 4th edition I brushed up against briefly, and I don't remember very well, but I kind of remember that, yeah.
Now, when it comes to what you were doing with Dragonbane, there's not Dragonbane, DragonRune. Sorry.
Right. We went way off tangent there. Yeah.
I go off tangent all the time, because I never try and pretend that this is that kind of professional interview setup. But I do appreciate that when it comes to like these skills, the majority of them are combinations of abilities, since some games that have skill lists and associated abilities to them. Some abilities get more love than others. Looking at you, dexterity and intelligence.
Yeah.
But when you look at a lot of heroic figures in fiction, None of them are the. It's very even the dumb muscle isn't that dumb when it comes to their skills.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
you try and adapt Conan into some systems, and you've got to account for a bunch of different skills that he's shown some degree of proficiency in.
Sure.
In regard to that, has anyone ever brought up Mithras to you?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Mithras. So the way I describe DragonRune in like a elevator pitch kind of way is that it is a simulationist light or medium simulation game that sits somewhere on a range between Dragonbane and Mithras. So I'm very heavily pulling on the BRP lineage, but like I've gone a different way with it.
Yeah.
So it's just to give a brief overview of the way it works. It's a 2d10. And the reason I went with 2d10 is because you can draw a lot of information out of that, and it gives a bell curve roll. So, like, I like my... Some people like swing systems like D20, where it's very luck-oriented. I kind of like that professionalism that comes with a bell curve, where you kind of get a cluster of values. You know, but the 2d10 gives a bell curve-like roll, and you can get a lot of information out of those two dice. So, you know, when you normally have, in D&D, you have a roll to hit, and then you have a roll for damage.
Mm-hmm.
That's 2 rolls. Okay, that's not terrible, but it slows things down a little bit. If you then go to like Mithras or RuneQuest or Cyberpunk 2020 or whatever, you also then have your hit locations. And I like hit locations. Hit locations are cool. Like that's some of the simulation-y stuff that I enjoy because it helps tell the story based on the rolls. But that's a third roll, right? And then you have to do math for like, the hit locations in, like, for instance, hero system actually gives you a multiplier to what you rolled on your damage. Mm-hmm. And like, so you gotta do some math to figure out where you're going and all this kind of stuff. And like, it's cumbersome. Like, to get all these cool simulation-y bits in, you gotta do 3 rolls in most systems and math in between. Okay. I don't like that. That's not cool. Like, I'm not an OSR person, but I respect a lot of the OSR idea of like make things quick and snappy because it helps get things going. Yeah, so I started thinking
they say making things quick and snappy, and yet they're using the same kind of multiple roll setup.
Right, because they're focused on AC instead of like point armor or whatever, right? Which is, I mean, again, it is what it is. Every system has to have abstraction, even the most simulation. Like, you're not doing physics, therefore it's not a real simulation. So I hate to break it to those super hardcore folks, but you're still working with abstractions.
And even with that, regardless, it's still a game.
Right, and so it has to be fun, and most people do not find quadratic equations fun. And of course, quadratic equations aren't really what you're doing, even in more complicated, maybe in the Expanse when you're plotting your course, but whatever. Anyway, all that math is not super fun. So what I started thinking was thinking about the age system. I really like having that one die that's a different color that means something different. So I started thinking
referring to the stunt system.
Yes, which is like, I love the stunt system. Is the coolest thing from that system. I mean, it's a fine system, but the stunt system is neat. Of course, Mithras has something vaguely similar, so it's still kind of in the same whatever. Anyway, so basically in DragonRune, you have 2d10. One of them's a different color. That's your effect die. And so you roll 2d10, and the total has to be less than your skill to succeed. If it's doubles, it's an exceptional result. If it was a double fail, then it's an exceptional failure. If it's a double success, then it is an exceptional success, like a critical.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of automatically, like, if you're really good at a skill, you're more likely to get a critical result, basically a critical success. And if you're really bad at a result, you're more likely to get a critical fail, like automatically without you having to do any math or anything. It just happens from the way the math works out. But then the effect die tells you if it's combat, it tells you how much damage you did. And the other die tells you what hit location you hit. If you're not in combat, then you're only looking at the effect die, but it will tell you basically it's if you roll a 6 and the other guy rolls a 5, then you beat them. So it's kind of like a blackjack thing.
Are you familiar with Fading Suns?
I'm actually not. You mentioned that before.
Yeah.
And before we started recording, and I'm not, but that
Fading Suns is very much a blackjack-like system with its victory points set up. It is using a D20 in a roll-under sense.
Sure.
The target number that you're trying to go for is the sum of your attribute and skill plus or minus any relevant modifiers. You know how that goes.
Yeah.
But instead of trying to roll as low as possible, you're trying to roll high without going over. Because if you have that roll and you just roll a 1, you succeed, but it's a bare minimum kind of success.
Sure.
Whereas if say your roll is if say your target number is a 10 and you end up rolling a 9, you're going to have 9 victory points, thus a higher degree of success than rolling a straight 1. Which is why I call it D20 blackjack, because you're trying to get high without going over. And matching is how you get a critical fail.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
The one just below,
that's interesting.
Just below it is a critical success. And
that makes sense.
Just doubling the amount of victory points you get. And I often bring that one up whenever people tell me about how bad and unusable D20 is as a die system. I'm like, we got this one right here.
Right.
If D20 is that level of if that level is bad, then why is this one not having that problem?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, there's so many people who only know D20 as it's used in D&D.
Which is fine, but don't paint broad strokes with nothing but a pen.
Yes. Yep. I mean, I had a rather interesting conversation with a gentleman on Reddit who told me that Dragonbane was just a 5e wannabe, and I'm like, you don't
where the fuck did he get? I remember hearing
because it uses a D20. It uses a D20 in a fantasy setting, and therefore, obviously, it's 5e wanting to be like 5e, and you know,
you're probably familiar with that one quote from Billy Madison that everybody references, because that's what's going through my mind with that, and I can understand that, because when I covered the starter set for the Final Fantasy XIV RPG, I was seeing some people who were saying that it was somehow originally going to be a 5e game, but it got changed at the last minute. And the problem with that is the only dice that it uses is a D20 and D6s. That's it. And moreover, you're not rolling to see if you hit. You're rolling to see the effect, because when you use an action in that thing, you're going to hit. It's just, are you just going to do this bare minimum amount of damage, or are you actually going to do well enough that you can use the D6?
Oh. So it sounds a little bit like what Coville's doing with Draw Steel.
Yeah, except he's
okay.
Coville with Draw Steel, which I do want to do an extended video on in the future. He's not doing any roll to hit, period. And
Right, yeah.
that was the mistake I called out Ben Riggs for when he did that whole Golden Age article. Because
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one.
yeah, he was talking about how after the OGL fiasco and everybody doing their own thing, that the golden age of D&D is dead, and thus the golden age of tabletop is dead. I'm like, motherfucker, what we're in this position of is just a repeat of what we had back in the late '90s when when TSR went belly up. It didn't kill off tabletop as a whole.
No, now that you use a little bit more context, I remember hearing about that. I never actually read the article or whatever, but I kind of remember somebody telling me about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, Ben Riggs is kind of an idiot.
I honestly don't know much about the man, so I can't. I've never read any of his stuff or anything, so
I don't know him.
Know.
I don't know him personally. I'm only judging based on what he wrote.
Sure.
It's just what I find that he wrote wasn't all that good.
Sure.
I do have one particular question because
yeah.
From what I saw in the core book that you have for Dragonbane.
Mm-hmm.
Since it seems like you're going for a bit of a universalist / multi-genre approach, even with that simulation is bent. But one of the elephants in the room that I have to ask on is how you would handle magic.
Okay, so I actually had a big chunk of magic stuff. Well, I have a big chunk of magic stuff that's written. So, okay, first, I intend DragonRune to be a little bit of like a house system. Not for every game I ever do, because I have other systems that might fit other things better, but I have several games that I'm intending this ultimately to be for, basically. And it's a generalist thing. So first of all, it's like an SRD that I can put out under Creative Commons and say everything that's in the SRD is free and everything that's not in the SRD is not free, basically. And I can just make it really easy for people to know which one's which and whatever. But the magic, so it is still very kind of universalist. Like I have rules for hacking in the magic section as well, like because I have like one of the games I want to do is a cyberpunk game, but the arcane magic is very Ars Magica based, where you're taking how to best describe it for folks.
A setup and follow through kind of thing.
Yeah, so for folks who aren't familiar with Ars Magic, number one, like it's one of the most awesome games in the history of gaming, so check it out. But for those who aren't, the magic is essentially noun and verb. So to cast a fireball or a fire spell at someone, you're going to fire attack, or it's not fire. I can't remember what the actual verb, but like conjure or something like that. And so it's very open to interpretation. I like open to interpretation. My games are all built around like what does my group like, because like I feel like if I'm not making stuff that I want to play and I want to run, then what's the point? So my group loves open-ended spells and the ability to kind of do all kinds of crazy stuff. That's not like they really don't like spell lists. So, and I don't either for that matter. But so the idea there is essentially there are going to be like, and you can set, because it's a generalist thing, you can kind of set it up for your world, but having a set number of types of things, like for instance in the Glorantha game I'm running, I'm using the runes here, so fire, moon, movement, and whatever. And then I have the verbs, create, destroy, I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but anyway, I have a handful of of verbs, and you basically just mix and match them. And then there are a few other things like range and stuff like that comes into it, that might give you a bonus or a penalty, and you can spend resolve to reduce the penalty. So basically, if you do all these things, it's going to give you a -5. Well, I'm going to spend 5 resolve and not have a penalty, that kind of thing. Of course, resolve is a fairly finite resource. Anyway, divine is kind of up in the air. I have ideas for it, but haven't been able to quite nail down exactly what I want it to look like. I definitely want it to still be very open-ended, and I want it to be one of my least favorite things about D&D style things is I feel like the clerics really don't feel like they're a generic thing that then has 1 or 2 extra things based on their deity, and that to me is not interesting.
The whole party by themselves is what it is.
Well, I mean, sort of, yeah. To me, if clerics, why do all clerics have healing? Why do all clerics have turn undead?
I know what some people. Well, with turn undead, I can answer that because the answer has been given to me. But I will let you know in advance. I find the answer to be kind of bullshit. It is
right.
There was an implication, and I think Gygax talked about this, of having clerics be quasi vampire hunters.
Right. Sure.
Which is fine, and this is something I brought up with my criticism of the whole spells per day model. Those are out of universe explanations.
Yeah.
And this is where the biggest problem that I've had with something like D&D and similar kinds of games is not putting your foot down regarding setting.
Yeah.
You cannot be a setting specific game and a setting agnostic game at the same time.
Yeah. 100%.
And a lot of the problems that end up sprouting from the way D&D does things, like the cleric thing you mentioned, is a consequence of playing half-seas with that.
Right. Right.
Whereas so you look at something like, say, we brought up Shadowrun.
Yeah.
And with Shadowrun, when you're casting spells, you have to deal with spell drain.
Yes.
Why do you have to deal with spell drain? The answer is very obvious. Casting spells tires out casters, and it is and you have a lot of evidence for that, and you have a very consistent thing because Shadowrun is not interested in doing any other setting than the 6th world.
Yeah. Yep. And although honestly, I mean, well, I'm this. I don't want to rag on D&D. Well, no, and I understand. Like, I try and be positive about all games. There's a tendency for people to rag on stuff and that they don't like, and I don't like D&D. Like, I'll be clear about that. But and that there are things I think it could do better or worse or whatever. But I don't really want to like focus on the negative things. The only reason I brought it up was, if you have a sun deity, like they should have sun powers, right? Like light and fire, and sure, maybe they turn undead or whatever. But like the deity of healing is the one who has the healing, resurrect, and whatever. And like there should be a difference between them. Like if you're playing,
let me make another case for that. What if I already brought up queer, but what if your particular deity of choice is more of a war god, like say Mars? Mars would not really give a shit about vampires, and he wouldn't give a shit about healing.
Agreed.
And later editions have had domains where there are certain spells you can get from them, but they're like one spell out of a dozen or so that you're gonna have, so there's not as much impact. I agree. Like how Fantasycraft handled it, because for one, magic is optional in your campaign with how it's set up with the campaign qualities, but also instead of getting like divine spells, Fantasycraft had a path system. And that
Mm-hmm.
path, there were certain paths that were the equivalent of domains. Each of them had 5 steps, and these were exclusive class features if you picked the priest class.
Mm.
But the forms of the paths that you would get were dependent on your particular alignment. Alignment is not the 9 alignment grid like in D&D. It's more of the church or the deity or whatnot that is granting that kind of thing is also granting you a ritual weapon. Ritual weapons are the equivalent of a focus for that particular priest.
Mm.
It can be the focus for their spells, or it can just be a weapon that they automatically have training in as a priest. So because of that, you don't necessarily have to have the cleric wielding a mace.
Sure.
Unless the particular alignment has it as such.
Right.
And again, going with someone who's a follower of Mars, they'd probably have like a sword or a spear as their ritual weapon of sorts, and all of their spells would be more about buffing people so that they can do better fighting.
Yes. Yeah, and maybe some attack spells of some variety or something, those kind of things. Yeah, 100%. Which was definitely like the cleric of the healing goddess. I can't think of who that might be in IRL, but in the real world. But like your healing goddess would definitely not have any kind of attack spells or whatever. Again, RuneQuest might be like my RuneQuest is showing, but like I definitely think that even though I only found RuneQuest in the last 6 years or so, like it really changed
for it because RuneQuest is getting the video game treatment.
Yes, and I'm excited about that because it's like a tactical game, and I love tactical.
It is
tactical
a
games.
tactics game that is done by the same team that did Warhammer Battle Sector.
Oh no, I didn't know that. I didn't realize. That's cool. Yeah, that's cool.
I did a bit of digging, and I found that connection, and when I found out about that, I was basically like, okay, we've got some people who know what they're doing, because Battle Sector was trying its absolute best to get as close to replicating some of the combat of the 40K war game as it could on a PC.
Neat.
And obviously you can't do that 1-to-1 with something like RuneQuest, because RuneQuest never had a war game equivalent.
Right.
But you can certainly get close. And the fact that kind of emulation is something that they've been known for gives me a degree of optimism that they can pull off something like RuneQuest. And
there's also. Go ahead.
This. When it comes to the whole doing divine magic, does divine magic really need to have a separate rule set?
So, in my opinion, it does. And the reason for that is I feel like each type of magic should feel different. Like, if you're playing a wizard, your spell casting, I feel like, should feel different than what the priest is doing versus what the spirit monk or the spirit shaman or whatever what they're doing. Summoning spirits and bonding them and stuff like that. Like those to me. Again, one of the things I don't like about D&D is how that really. If you didn't tell me who was playing what, and you just had a cleric and a wizard, doing whatever, like you wouldn't really necessarily notice the difference between them. At least in older editions. I don't know about 5th edition. Again, I don't know anything about that really. But in 3rd edition, for the most part, unless you just happen to know that only clerics could heal, or something like that, you wouldn't really know which class was which because the magic is the same. Basically, it's just a different spell list.
Yeah, and it's when it comes to, it sounds like what you want to have is that it's more than just different spell lists that is the difference. And if in that case, I'm perfectly fine with it. I remember years ago when I talked about Zweihander, and I've said I feel like there isn't because it's trying to be Warhammer and all but name. I feel like in the process of that, the distinction between sorcery and miracles has kind of been lost. Yes, I know all magic is chaos magic. Yes, I get that. But
it's heresy.
With the way magic works in Warhammer, you have different winds of magic and each of them is specific around a certain spell list. You know, a gray wizard isn't going to be casting or even looking like a bright wizard.
Right.
Gray wizards are all about mystery and obscuring things, and the bright wizard is all like, hey, this is flammable. So is that. Let's make more things flammable.
Right. You know, yeah, 100%. And going back also to, you know, like Final Fantasy, you know, your white wizard and your black wizard. Again, there's no mechanical difference. It's just the spell list, and I don't like that, because to me, if I'm getting power from my deity,
there wasn't
that should feel.
There wasn't difference at the time, but with subsequent games that has changed.
I haven't played anything past 10 or 11. I haven't played anything past 11, so I don't really. I know a little bit about them, but I just haven't had time for games in a long time.
It's no longer. It hasn't really been just the spell list difference for quite a while, and obviously in something like 14, it became more about the hard elements versus the soft elements in terms of how it worked. And I can say with my project, one of the bigger differences is black mages are elementalists essentially, and white mages weaponize overhealing.
Okay, interesting.
Like anyone could potentially cast like fire or something like that, but the black mage can do more out of it and more out of the effect. And same thing goes with casting cure. It also means that it's still a good idea to cast cure even if somebody's topped up, because you can use the excessive amount as either temp HP or even use it as holy damage.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I got the idea because of the fact that I was playing Team Fortress 2, and overheal is a significantly big deal for a lot of strategies with the medic.
Okay.
That and the most common combo when it comes to medic is the medic and heavy. Having his healing guns firing constantly at the heavy while the heavy's constantly taking damage.
Okay, that makes sense.
The medic doing that in order to build up uber charge, and in the case of using that on the heavy, can make him invulnerable for a few seconds.
Oh yeah, okay, I'm with you. That makes sense. That clicks. Okay.
But it was that idea of instead of having the medic as the designated healer, give players a reason to want to pick it, aside from, well, we need a healer.
Oh yeah 100%. And I definitely like the biggest issue around divine casting, the reason I actually took all the magic stuff out of it when I posted up the last version was because I really wasn't happy with with how the divine was working at the time. I need to figure out. I need to go back to the drawing board and kind of figure out exactly what I want out of it, because I really want the connection to the god to be important, and not just lip service. Like in Eberron, my group jokes that the gods in Eberron are just divine ATM machines, You swipe your card to get your spells for the day, and that's like really all you need out of them. Otherwise, they can just go away, which is fun and interesting, and definitely different from normal D&D. But like, I want something a little bit more that, like, again, a little bit more Glorantha, a little more RuneQuest.
There are a couple of projects I'd recommend taking a look at or adding to the research pile in that regard.
Yeah.
One of them is Anima. Now, I know a lot of people talk about how Anima is this absolutely broken thing that nobody should play, but a lot of people who have that mindset, in my opinion, have 20-sided brain rot, if you catch my drift.
I've heard of it, but I've never dove into it, but I've heard of it.
It is heavily based on Rollmaster.
Okay, I'm familiar with MERPs, and then of course against the Dark Lord or whatever,
against the Dark Master, which I've
Dark Master,
have several years ago. Max is a good guy, and when it comes to it, Anima aside from the fact that Anima has its spells in a kind of path system, as a in a distinct way. It's not really level based in terms of it. It's a whole other matter. But there's also the concept of divine gifts. These are given by two factions of deities, the Beryls and the Shahats, essentially the Lords of Light and Dark. And each of them kind of has a track setup of how aligned you are with them that goes from 1 to 100. And a short list of actions that will either gain you their favor or disfavor. The higher up you go, the bigger actions you have to do to go further up. But the closer you get to 100, the more gifts and the more powerful gifts you can pick from.
Gotcha.
So, and obviously that's a specific thing, but taking that approach would certainly fit that goal of a different type of spell list for divine casting. For sure. The other entry that I think is worth considering is the Spheres of Power expansion for Pathfinder and more recently D&D 5th edition, which is a talent-based spellcasting alternative.
Interesting.
Instead of a spell list, there's a collection of talent trees. And while you do have spell points, you spend them more on enhancing your effects rather than paying for the effect itself.
That's interesting.
So things like a lot of the typical spell spheres in D&D would be their own little talent tree. Every time you gain a level, you can either learn a new sphere and gain its default ability, or you can learn a talent that lets you do more stuff with that initial talent. Like the Destruction Sphere is one of the most common ones for Blaster Caster. When you take it, you immediately get the Destructive Blast ability. It's a single target ranged spell that does a certain amount of bludgeoning damage based on your level. The talents that you could pick don't increase the damage per se, but they do things like change the area of effect to a cone, or change it to a chain, chain lightning, or change the type of damage you're doing, or even let you set it up so that instead of just being a blast, you're setting up a trap. And
that's cool.
That's kind of the approach it's taking. In addition, it has a rule called casting traditions. This is basically where you set up the rules and drawbacks of spellcasting. In a every 2 drawbacks gives you 1 boon kind of approach. So if you want to have it where casting requires a blood sacrifice, that's where you do it. If you'd want to have casting where you have to use a particular skill instead of the typical approach, that's where you do it. If you have to have it that you have to specifically use certain components, that's where you do it.
Oh yeah, that sounds pretty cool. I'll definitely check that out as well for sure. And actually circling back to what we were talking about early on, I just kind of thought about this. And Lodos has that very distinctive mage, wizard cleric shaman kind of thing. Between Slain and Ito and Deedlit. Like they've not so much in the game. Like what little I've read of a translated version of the original Sword World, like it's not really in the game version, but like in the anime and the books, like there's a very distinct difference between how they do stuff.
There is a distinct difference when it comes to the different types of casters, because for one, with Sword World, you can't approach classes in the same way you would in, say, D&D. You don't pick a class and then level in that. You spend experience to gain levels in classes, almost like they're skill packages.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay.
Because of that, and this was further expanded on in Sword World 2.0. For example, the closest thing to the blaster caster is the sorcerer, who uses true speech magic. They can get but they're the only ones who get access to familiars.
Gotcha.
The shaman, which gets access to spiritualism magic, they get access to be able to control undead and control golems. And there are certain materials that they consume in order to create golems, though there's enchanted variants of those consumables to allow you to make the golem but not consume the material. And
interesting.
Each undead or as you level up, you can get access to stronger undead or golems, which require their own thing, and with golems you can customize them using gems. Just to
interesting.
The Artificer has its own Magitech spell list. They're the only ones who get to use guns, and a lot of their spells involve creating an enchanted bullet.
Okay.
So, and then there's Fairy Tamers, which are the widest when it comes to their spell casting, because they have 6 different spell paths for the 6 elements. But at the start of the day, you can only pick between 4 of them that you have access to. And
right.
You can summon fairies as well, but while the summon fairy is active, you can't use fairy magic.
Gotcha.
And they usually carry around those fairies in gems. In fact, it's usually implied that you're going to get a gem case to carry a bunch of different fairies.
That makes sense. I remember reading when I was kind of glancing through a copy of Sword World 2. I saw them talking about gems, and I was, what is that about? But now I understand. That's what I get for skimming. Makes sense.
Later on, things like alchemists would be added, which can convert material from say monsters into these different colored cards to use evocations. They don't use MP; they use those cards. There's 5 different colors at 5 different grades. Not 5 different grades, 4 different. And you can, when you're getting loot from monsters, you can convert that to either something you sell off for Gamel, which is their version of GP, or convert it into a material card. Of course, you can buy material cards, and there's items like card shooters, which allow you to use the effects as ranged attacks. But the point is that there's a variety of because of the fact that each of the spell lists is significantly different, and it's built around the idea of hyper focusing on what each class can do, because you're gonna be multi-classing. Each of them has to be laser focused.
Yeah.
And that's why I've said trying to do 5e in Sword World can't really work.
Yeah.
Especially since Sword World has a defined setting. In the original game, it was Forcelia. In 2.0, it's Raxia. In 2.5, it's Raxia, but the Alflame continent.
Gotcha.
And everything from the races, the classes, the abilities, and such is tied to that. You know, warlocks aren't the kind of warlock you'd see in D&D. They're more like demonologists.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that sounds cool.
They do have a spell list, but they have a whole subsystem all about summoning demons, and make very clear you are playing in dangerous waters when you try and do that.
Sure.
Because just
That's
because
cool.
you summon it doesn't mean it's going to obey you.
Oh, that's my favorite kind of summoning. Honestly, I adore that. I adore that kind of stuff, because there's like, classic Elric kind of, losing control of the demon or whatever, and it going on a rampage and stuff like that's that's epic.
Yeah.
And
there are some classes that use something that's like magic but isn't using MP in the traditional sense.
Sure.
And speaking of, one of the other casting-like aspects that's been in the BRP family for the longest time is Mystics, which is meant to be the stand-in for Jedi or monks' mystical abilities and the like. Are you planning on having something equivalent to that in the future?
Possibly. So there are three settings that are in my head here that I'm kind of making this ultimately for.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is fairly well done. I've actually ran several games in it over the years. But it's it's vaguely like Viking, Celtic, whatever. It's not on our world. There's different deities and stuff, but I drew a lot of inspiration from Viking. There's basically one group, culture group that's Viking related, and one that's Celtic related, and there's a third that's vaguely Slavic oriented. And they're kind of in a they have certain similarities, certain differences, and anyway, but it's very low magic. It's very grounded, and in fact, all of these are, and it definitely wouldn't have anything like that. In fact, it pretty much is there's not very much attack oriented magic in that. It's very much oriented towards the idea of fate, and seeing fate and herbs and stuff like that. So it's very kind of grounded in that way. There's not a whole lot, the only way to have attack magic is to be Jotun blooded, and you basically would have access to the element of your forebear. So an ice Jotun blooded would have ice powers, but they're seen as dangerous. If you display your Jotun elemental magic in town, it's pitchfork time, kind of thing. So it's very much not your typical D&D just blast everything or whatever. It's a lot more subtle than that. Another one is vaguely is an actual Bronze Age setting. That's a little bit more higher magic or whatever, and that's kind of the one that's foremost in my brain. That's where the stuff I was talking about, arcane and spirit and divine magic, is at. There might be a place for mysticism there. I haven't delved into everything in that setting really very much. It's just kind of something that's percolating in the back of my head, and several pages worth of notes. And then the third is a cyberpunk game that is not as gonzo as Shadowrun. It has but it's a little bit more.
Would it be more akin to Night City rather than Sixth World?
It's a little bit in between the two. Like there's like originally it was much more Night City oriented, but I've kind of decided that I kind of like the idea of maybe having like psionics. So there is a little bit of like magic oriented type thing going on here, and possibly some sort of like mysticism thing might work there, like the biokinesis or something, where you like, you know, those stories of monks who control their heartbeat and stuff like that. You know, those kind of concepts. It might come in there, so like it's a possibility in the future, but it's not something that I've like thought too hard about at this point of like how I might do it or whatever. But that's the only setting for certain that it might come up in. But again, it's a generic book. I plan on having like all these magic systems in the actual like DragonRune document when I'm done with it. It's just going to be the specifics of the implementation that are going to, or you know, and not everything will be available. Like again, the Viking thing is going to have very little magic. It'll probably just have herbalism, which is like a whole magic system that I've been working on because my wife loves alchemy. So again, any system I make has to basically have some sort of herbalism in it, because that she adores that kind of stuff. But you know, it'll probably just have alchemy and then, you know, some like divination and really kind of custom made stuff just for that setting. You know, but the idea with DragonRune in general is like a base framework that will get altered to fit. More specifically,
since that is that base framework, there is the possibility that somebody may put in house rules that lean more into a less grounded, more epic kind of approach. Is that something you've taken into account?
Oh yeah, I mean, you definitely could do that. It's a fairly it is like Dragonbane and RuneQuest, a fairly lethal system. You don't have hit points. Basically, the damage that's done to the hit location, you know, your arm, let's say, gives you that penalty to actions using that body part. So, like, again, I hit you in the arm for 3 damage after your armor and stuff gets taken into account. That gives you a -3 to hit back, or to use your shield if it's your left arm. And so that's it very quickly, kind of like any other game that has penalties and stuff for wounds. You know, it gets gruesome pretty quickly. And then basically, if your wound penalty exceeds your stamina bonus, then you're basically disabled. Like that's disabled. Like you've got such a bad wound that you can't even use the arm. If it ever gets to like double your stamina, then it's like off. You know, you've lost that arm. And if it's your body or your head, when you get disabled, you're actually unconscious. So kind of like RuneQuest, there's a lot of ways to end a fight that doesn't actually involve killing the other person. So there's a whole lot more of like, what are we going to do with these people that we've dispatched? Like, are we going to kill them, tie them up, ransom them, whatever? Which I find interesting. It's an interesting question to put before the table. You find out a lot about your friends when you put them in charge of helpless NPCs. But you know, you could totally. I could think, you know, like, you could totally turn that into something less dark, you know, and less gritty, by like changing up how the damage works or whatever. And I don't think it would be that hard. You just, you know, it'd be a little bit of a homebrew that you'd have to do, but I can't imagine it would be too difficult to do. So yeah, people could totally do that and probably have a real good time with it. It might even be something I end up putting in a sidebar, like an alternate health system or something, depending on if I end up coming up with something or whatever as I'm just playing around with stuff. But it's definitely a system where finding an alternative way of dealing with stuff is probably the best choice. Like, it's not, there's combat rules, there's ways to get really good at combat. Like, if you want to play like, a Spartan, to use a Greek analogy, if you want to play a Spartan, you can play a Spartan and just totally destroy. But there's always that chance that you're going to slip on a pebble and get impaled on, the farmer's, pitchfork or whatever, just like in real life. Like, even the most badass soldier can get killed in one shot, so like, no matter how good you are and no matter how good your equipment is, you still like look at combat with like trepidation, and that's the feel I want. Like, I don't want everything to just be like, well, we mash the attack button until everything dies. I don't find that enjoyable. Some people do, and that's fantastic. To me, that's having that little bit of fear factor about getting into a violent conflict. My players tend to be like, okay, well, how can we talk our way through this, or how can we sneak our way past this, or how can we go at this with like a political solution? Like, maybe we get their boss to rein them in or whatever. Like, it just kind of opens up different ways, and so that's one part of the OSR mentality that I do kind of like and have embraced with the rules as written as of now. But there's nothing that would stop you at all from doing a more high-powered version with like a different hit point system.
Yeah, that was kind of where I was getting at, because you may have your particular way, but once it's out in the wild, you don't know how things are going to go in terms of what people are going to do with it.
Yeah, 100%.
But with all that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my monastery and enjoy the madness that happens around here.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Like, I just realized that we've been talking for like an hour and a half or something, and I didn't really realize, because it's just been fun, like, talking about games. We've talked about every game under the sun, it feels like, but that was good. Well, thank you very much for having me on. I really do appreciate it. If anybody's interested in checking out what I've got, the playtest version is on itch.
On the YouTube version of this stream, I will have a link to the itch.io page for DragonRune.
Really appreciate that, and there will be a new version coming out here in a few months. I'm taking a break from this right now and working on some other projects to kind of let ideas percolate and whatever. I do already know from my playtests that there are a few things that are going to be changing about it. I'm going to be taking out the personality traits stuff, so or maybe just putting them in a sidebar. Again, I like sidebars with alternate rules, just be aware that it's not finished. It's not a complete game. It's for playtesting, and of course, if anybody does playtest it, hit me up. I'd love to hear your experiences, and if there's anything that you loved or you hated or whatever. So
yeah, I can certainly get that. And of course, a sincere thanks goes out to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come all the way to my temple and enjoy the madness that happens around here. And anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.
年々重心気